sometimes called transformational or objective. It is art that has as its intention and underlying basis the aim of transforming and evolving consciousness on an individual, worldwide, and universal level. Unlike subjective art, which has different unconscious effects and meanings for each individual that experiences it, transformational art awakens consciousness to the realization of the underlying unity and oneness of all existence, in which uniqueness and undividedness are inherent in everyone and everything. There is no limit to the creative art can be manifested, whether it is transmitted through the various visual art media or through music, movement, mime, dance, theater, literature, architecture, or any newly formed expression. The core symbols of the art always reflect and invoke a process of multidimensional understandings that grow, deepen, and transform in correspondence with the individual's conscious evolution. In other words, certain works of art and architecture try to take human consciousness beyond the subject-object dichotomy, beyond concepts and percepts, into a realm beyond separateness and duality. This is the realm beyond ego. No otherness exists here. In a sense, the artifact acts as a catalyst for turning one's attention back upon itself, so that instead of looking outwardly at external objects for cues for finding out about reality and its source, the attention now focuses inwardly upon itself, seeking to see who it is that is doing all the looking in the first place. When one sees the seer, one comes in direct confrontation with one's essential identity. Notha Suttam. Know thyself. This is the preliminary aim of all such art, to bring the knower to know itself. There seems to be a recognition factor within consciousness that allows for the disengagement from the almost total fascination with external phenomena back into an aspect of reality that is not limited by the constraints of subjects and objects. This conscious factor within consciousness of being, consciousness of being with a big B, is what allows realities, no matter how fragmented or incomplete an existence may appear from within the context of any phenomenal viewpoint. In fact, every phenomenal event and lifetime is the actualization of its archetypal potential, because every phenomenal event is in fact a manifestation of an eternal archetype, and because every archetype is an emanation of the primordial, sourceless, beyond perfect reality. The essential nature of everything is this primordial reality itself. Conscious art and architecture tries to shift the attention away from the apparently limited and fragmented views and identifications accumulated within phenomenal existence and experience, back into the conscious non-phenomenal point of an unbroken and unified view of self, which shifts into the process of letting go of unity. This is analogous to penetrating into the very essence of what zero is, what infinity is, and then living from that basic beyondness. This is a voyage into a realm of consciousness that is comprehensible to being, and when not comprehensible to being, then accommodated by unconditional consciousness. Yet ultimately, there is nothing that can contain or define anything. All is completely, fulfillingly void. This is the nature and essence of everything. Welcome to the Architects of Conscious Transformation. Previously, we were exploring the cultures of the Byzantine Empire and the architecture that they produced, and one of the biggest, most influential points in that culture was the creation of the dome of the Hagia Sophia, and which was sort of a development of the pantheon in the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, carried on after the fall of Rome. And it went through the Dark Ages, not in the Dark Ages, but it in fact was a thriving cosmopolitan point on the earth, and very, very great works of architecture and art were produced from there. The most well-known, of course, are these domed churches that were created, such as the Hagia Sophia, dedicated to the feminine aspect of divinity, the divine wisdom. And this was in Christianity, which was a very patriarchal religion, but at that time the feminine aspect was very much revered and respected. So the domes of the Byzantine, and also the fantastic mosaic work, led to other advances in the art, which tried to basically present a view of reality that was resplendent and indicative of the higher realms of consciousness, the heavenly realms as they were called in that particular religious context. This view of the outside of St. Mark's in Venice is in fact a copy of many of the previous Byzantine works farther east. And you can see over top in the arches here the beautiful, beautiful mosaic work in those particular outside arches. And they glitter and glisten and basically evoke in the viewer and in the experiencer an indication of the light and the expansiveness that open consciousness allows one to interface with and experience. And then we went from that culture, the Byzantine, to the Islamic cultures, which borrowed a great deal from the Greco-Roman culture in terms of architecture, but in terms of the Islamic traditions, they took the geometry of the Greeks to the ultimate formulation. Their geometries and their intricacies of expression are, in effect, unparalleled in terms of the beauty and the subtlety as well. Because the human form could not be expressed in that particular religious context, the geometry, however, was taken even further and as far as it could possibly go with that type of mathematics. And so the outside of the mosques that were created, this is an Ottoman mosque in Turkey, shows beautiful variegated tile work on the minarets, and inside the domes were these incredible vistas of expanding spheres. The sphere, as we mentioned, was the Greek representation of perfection. And so for the Islamic, the Muslim cultures, wherever they were, domes and the spheroidal shape of them represented ascension into greater and greater perfection, perfection upon perfection. And so the multi-layered and ascending domical structures, as viewed from inside, flooded with light, flooded with incredible intricacy of pattern, with the holy, sacred words of the scriptures of the Quran, beautifully illustrated through the calligraphy, have had no equal in terms of the subtlety and the beauty of their power. And so everything in that culture was intended, once again, to blow away the ego, the self-centered identification that most human beings seem to, at one time or another, become embedded in and almost consumed by. And so these architectural works and the artistic works that were complementary to them all attempted to inspire the individual so much that there was no possibility of grasping the totality that was viewed, that was being experienced. And so these works were, in fact, a dedication to expanding in such a way that the ego was automatically shed, that one came into this space of reverence and of surrender, because surrender is the initial and the key point of Islam, the surrender to the absolute, the surrender to the highest consciousness, to the surrender to that which is unknowable by any kind of mind structure, any kind of body structure, and yet at the same time is connected integrally with it. So surrender to the absolute was the basis of it, and this surrender, this awe-inspiring ascension, was in fact related to that particular culture's strongest feature, if you will, which, as anyone has, anyone who might have traveled knows about the great pride involved. So the shattering of pride was intended to be part of the work of this architecture and art, to basically break that crystallized idea of arrogance and pride and show that it was nothing, that it was absolutely nothing, that there was that which was totally transcendent of it, and that in terms of artifacts, many locations in the East and the Middle East, especially in the Middle Eastern sector of the planet Earth, have artifacts that have information. They're called by some legomenisms, but you might say readable artifacts, artifacts that can be deciphered by those who are sensitive enough to the vibration. But the key to deciphering them, the key to entering into an interface with these psychometrizable artifacts, is the emotion of humiliation, and that is intentionally implanted there. That's the key. One has to feel utter humiliation in the presence of a resonating artifact in many of the places in the Middle East in order to access them, because pride and arrogance is so deeply embedded in the psyche in that part of the world. And so humiliation, mind you, pride and arrogance are not not at all relegated to the Middle East. It's a human feature that has rooted itself everywhere. And so that is part of the process of breaking down the ego to surrender through the feeling, through the emotional state of humiliation, of being totally nothing. And then one can be filled with something higher when one recognizes one's true nothinglessness, and one's true meaninglessness. And then one can be filled with something that is greater than that. So, in these cultures, very strong medicine, spiritual medicine, but these beautiful, beautiful kinds of geometrical works were not only used in architecture, but in any form that could transmit the information, the knowledge of a non-dualistic way of being. A non-dualistic way of being, yes. Even in Islam and any culture. That non-duality is the underlying basis of those cultures as well. And in this, the incredible rug work of the Artabil rug, the weaving work I meant of the Artabil rug, the art and the technique of geometrical expression through an organic form, such as plants, little tendrils, little pistils, little blossoms, has been taken to the highest level of any culture. And as was stated before, 26 million hand-tied knots in this work of transcendent art, truly conscious art, and it still stands, and anyone who stands before it is, to say the least, overwhelmed by the immensity of the consciousness, the attention, and the focus, and the true unity of presence that it took to create this work. And from the rug weaving of the Artabil, we go to Isfahan, and once again we see this vegetable theme woven into everything, even the hard surfaces of tiles, as in the surface of the Grand Mosque at Isfahan. This is the rapture of paradise, denoting the kind of ascension and intricacy and unbelievable detail, and almost like expressing infinity in the finite form of this beautiful mosque. You can see that everything here is perfectly geometrical, and yet there are asymmetries involved with it. So asymmetry and symmetry are the basis of conscious art and architecture, that there has to be a break from symmetry in order to allow new energy in at different points in the process of expression, in the process of absorbing it and being in this kind of situation. Being in an architectural form such as this great mosque or a great cathedral, as we'll see later, or anything that has that kind of unitive intention behind it, that will give us the key into how we respond to these works of art. How we can actually, when we go there, when we're present there, we can fully interface with the work and, in effect, receive the real knowledge about reality beyond any kind of dualistic notion. We can receive that, but we have to prepare ourselves. We have to prepare ourselves by not being distracted, by paying full attention and keeping our focus of attention on that which is undivided in ourselves. Excuse me. Then we traveled from the Islamic cultures of the Middle East, you might say, into India. And here, under the Mughals, was created by Indian craftsmen one of the greatest architectural works of any decade or epoch, the Taj Mahal. Its simplicity and its elegance and beauty of form continues to be an example of what real conscious architecture and art can be. It isn't based on just the social conditions that this was built into. The story behind it is the usual human story. However, the architects who are summoned to create this, the craftsmen who did all the inlay work, those individuals were connected to traditions that were much, much older than the individuals who commissioned them. You know, the tradition of kingship and so on is not as old as the tradition of awakening human beings to the inherent perfection of their own true nature. And so the Taj Mahal stands as an example of a certain type of perfection that can be achieved even through apparently limited materials. It still points to that which is beyond limitation. It points to a sphere, a realm that is beyond a local perspective. So from the culture of the Mughals in India, we're going to now revisit the seed, one of the seed cultures of conscious evolution on the planet India. Long before anyone had a notion of consciousness in the sense of as a science and as anything else, the Indians, the people in India, were already developing their meditation techniques and their techniques of transforming consciousness through their symbology, through their art, and through their daily practices. What we're looking at right here is the primordial symbol of Brahman, Om or Aum. It is as old as perhaps humanity itself. This presentation, this representation, it's a representation of the Absolute. Brahman is actually the first formulation of divinity in this culture. It goes before the personal or the personalized manifestations of the various divinities that later appeared in the culture, which we will see very shortly. But this, Om, represents the impersonal as well as the manifest aspect of reality. This represents the Absolute, and that's all that has ever been able to be represented as. Even that can't represent it. The oldest Vedas only refer to it as that which can't even be known by that which knows everything. So Brahman was in fact the first emanation of a principle that was understood by human beings in India long ago. And this Brahman, this notion of the Absolute, creating and yet being the creation itself, and transcending the creation, and transcending even itself that created it. This notion was symbolized in this Shri Om that we are seeing projected here. But that is the starting point. And to understand India and to understand Indian art and architecture, one needs to understand this. That this is the basis of everything else. All the god forms, all the goddesses, everything emanates from this and returns to this. Om. And here we see, excuse me, we see the very basic Hindu Trimurti, the Trinity of Hinduism. On I guess on your right, viewing it, would be the masculine aspect, which would be Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, creator, maintainer, preserver, destroyer, in its masculine aspect, in its active aspect. And then the feminine aspect, as represented by Parvati, Lakshmi, and Saraswati, who are the feminine aspects of this Trinity. So there's a masculine and feminine equally strong, equally powerful in this basic principle that was early Hinduism. This triad, this Trinity, if you will, it is the Trinity, which is also something that was carried on later on by other religions as well, represents a balancing of three forces: positive, negative, and neutral. And this principle in everything Indian comes through in the art and the architecture. But underlying it, don't forget, underlying this manifestation of Trinityness, triadness, is the Om. Om is basically the ocean out of which these drops arise, these God forms, these manifestations of deity arise out of that Brahman, that inconceivable Godhead, if you will. It is that out of which all gods issue and return. And so these three we will meet in greater detail very soon. This is the Trimurti of the masculine aspect: Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. This is from Elephanta, in the caves at Elephanta. And you can see from the expression of this particular work that it is very much implacable looking. These individuals, these God forms, if you will, had an uncertain, not certainly, something that was implacable and impartial to them. These God forms, as they were demonstrated through human beings now, these God forms represented utter impartiality and high indifference to everything. Not uncaring, in fact, totally caring in the most intimate and deepest way, and yet not being thrown off balance by any kind of extreme, any kind of disruption. Imperturbable and undisruptible is the portrayal of the Trinity here. This is a more friendly, modern-day version of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, each with their own emblematic symbol: the trident, and the drum, and the wheel, and the flower. It's all part, and the conch shell. All of these deities, and of course the garland for Vishnu, all of these are trying to bring the attention into a recognition of something that is present in itself. Humanity discovered these forms and they expressed them as human. These gods are not abstract. They are not some kind of mathematical incongruity that can't be understood. These are deities that are not only transcendent and beyond human life, they are in fact human life. So they are not disconnected from life. They are involved in life and are in fact responsible for life, and they are examples to the human to become one with that. That tradition in India, in India of the God-man to become, or God-woman, to become a realized divine being was the whole point of life in the first place. So to be that, to be one with that is the purpose of all life. So this is not ambiguous at all. It is direct in its statement that we as human beings need to access this and become conscious of this and then become one with it, to become perfected and complete in this, which is ourselves as well. This is part of our humanity. Part of our humanity is divinity, according to these teachings and traditions. Now, this lovely portrayal of the avatars of Vishnu, as you can see in their various forms, the 10 avatars of Vishnu before the renewal of this age, or up to the renewal of this age, shows us with abstract symbology, and yet at the same time it is in effect still touchable by the human. It's knowable by the human through deep meditation, through practices of spiritual development. And so when we look at these works of art as they're portrayed, with all the hands, arms, showing different powers and different kinds of qualities of spiritual initiation and perfection, these artworks are intended to convey what can't be conveyed simply through words. To look at this picture, one could learn and learn and learn and learn more and more about everything that potentially is oneself in its true essential nature. And that's the intention of all art like this. That was Vishnu, the preserver, and who has many very famous avatars, including Krishna and Rama. But this is another version of the deity in the form of Shiva. Shiva represented as both male and female, equally in one form. Ardhanarishvara. And this is, you see, the large full hips of the feminine and the beautiful breasts and the soft features on one side of the face, and the stronger, maybe more stern features of the masculine on the other side, all combined into one being. And this unity of, you might say, polar opposites, but not polar, when they are manifest and integrated in one form, then they are just perfect complements. The complementarity of our nature, being both masculine and feminine in a balanced form, is what this deified representation is pointing toward. That we, each of us who have been, you might say, come into the world with only one sex or another sex in the ascendant, in the dominant position in ourselves, whether we're male or female, what our real spiritual work and our true work in life is to be, is creating a form that has both male and female, equally balanced, equally potent, and therefore infinitely more powerful, infinitely more conscious of everything in the universe. It is, in effect, an expression of a non-duality being, a being who has gone beyond duality because they've unified all opposites, all dividedness, all fragmentation into an unbreakable, continuously uniform form. There cannot be any conflict in a manifestation such as this. So this is Shiva Shakti in one being. And this is, in effect, the purpose of human life, is to bring everything that is, throwing us off balance and bringing it into an unshakable and undisruptible balance, like that. And therefore, from this, no fall can come. We cannot fall off the tightrope anymore because we're the way. We're off the tightrope, and we have become the way itself, once we have embodied this. And this goes to the architecture then. So these principles that have been in India for many, many thousands of years, before any of the great architectural works, the ideas and the practices were present long before the need to build huge temples or any other kinds of structures. Those principles were then put into all of the architecture, all of the art. India can be singled out as probably one of the most spiritual locations on the planet ever. Just the continuity of the focus on spiritual development, on spiritual evolution, on conscious evolution is probably the oldest on the planet in terms of continuity and in terms of a still existing, still living tradition that continues in that way. This is a temple plan at Madera, and as you can see, it's taking the four directions. That is a very important factor in the teachings of India and in the East. The four directions, the four elements, and the fifth one that's in the center that basically integrates all the other four. But here it's very simple. It's almost cruciform, almost actually a square. Yet what the Indians do with it is quite fantastic, because the layering and the leveling also indicates part of the philosophical and spiritual tradition that is the essence of India. And so the architecture reflects the subtleties of those teachings. It isn't random, it isn't just built for show. It is built as an expression of the deepest philosophical and esoteric practices and teachings. In these works, one can, in fact, learn and learn more and learn more and never stop learning in terms of the intricacies of our own being. There are an infinite number of ways to know ourselves, and the architecture and art of India is one definite form that has attempted to convey that infinitude of possibility. Even in a small temple like this, is a very small temple, by the way, and yet and very simple, modest by Indian standards, and yet that sense of infinite detail and infinite texture is built into it, even at this scale. This is another very simple one. It's a rectangle, obviously based on a definite proportion. In the Indian canon of architecture and art, the proportions and the dimensions of these sacred places, these places of spiritual work were always consciously planned. They were always consciously located. There was no accidental process involved, except one that integrated accidentals into it as well. But the point is that in this system, it was very much consciously created to produce an effect on those who went into the space, such that when they experienced it, they would feel whatever it was that was intended to be imparted by the existence of this space in the first place. As you can see, this particular architecture is very solid, massive looking, and in fact, it hasn't got a very high arching kind of feel to it, and yet a lot of Indian architecture, at least preliminarily, was intended for housing artifacts of relics of saints, and so a lot of these places of significance were intended to house resonating artifacts that pilgrims could come to, that seekers could come to, and they would, in effect, enter these spaces, these reliquaries, basically, huge architectural reliquaries, in order to be in the presence of the spiritual potency of whatever the artifact was, or whoever it was dedicated to. Some great guru, some great saint. That's what these places of spiritual expression were built for. As you can see in the schematic, in the ground plan and the elevation, the temples in India were very much built on squares and rectangles, and yet the elevation part was bulbous and stacked as in almost like layers in terms of bell shapes and other kinds of forms. And so there was an attempt to bring both the masculine, sort of straight ahead linearity and the curvature of the feminine into every construction. So there's both an equally powerful linearity and circularity to Indian architecture. It's never extremely jagged and sharp-edged. There's always a curvature to it, regardless of whether it is in the shape of a square or not. There's a lot of curving going on in the process of getting from one end of it to another. Once again, one can see that there's a layering, a hierarchical structure to the way that the architecture is constructed and laid out. The pillars are very elaborately carved. Once again, this elaboration in terms of structure shows that at every scale, at every location in this, what would be called the universal hierarchy that's being manifested through the architecture, being demonstrated through architecture, the fineness of detail is not left out. Every scale of existence has its real place in the whole. It's a unified whole that is being expressed through Indian art and architecture. And once again, that unified presence, that unified continuity of being, once again, is grounded in that primordial Om, that Brahman, that is the basis of all other aspects of Hinduism that have grown out of it. Out of that primordial Om, that Brahman, that Godhead of unknowability and transcendence, arises everything that is knowable, that is manifest, that is to the absolute perfection that it can reach. And then once again, once it reaches the highest point, it arrives back at Brahman, out of which it arose. It's inherent. And as you can see here at this incredible temple at Madera, in India, the multiple hierarchical layers of the different heavens of the various levels of divinity all the way to the top are demonstrated through the architecture. It is a mountain in a sense, the holy mountain that is ascended until one reaches the highest level of being and consciousness. And at that point, you're beyond infinity. And so all the gods are represented, and there are multifarious versions of divinity in India, more than can be expressed in any kind of language, in any kind of art, even in any kind of mathematics. The whole point of this particular representation is that it's not really polytheism. Poly means many, but in India, the expression is going toward infinite theism. In other words, there's an infinity upon infinity of God forms in all the infinities. So there's no end to this. There can be 33,000 versions in Hinduism, but that is only pointing to that which in reality is infinite. So there's no end to the absolute in its manifestation, in its permutation of expression and evolution. So in this great temple here, you can see the attempt to convey just the sheer unexpressibleness of the divinity in all its different forms that we can understand as human beings. And to try and basically integrate that into oneself is the true practice of spiritual realization, to integrate all the forms, all the God forms into oneself, and to be a living, walking manifestation of that is part of our human potential and our human legacy. And we go from something so complex and varied to something so simple. This is a lantern roof schematic, a temple of Shiva at Pandrinthan, and it's an ancient temple, and it's very simple. All you do is lay squares across one another in a diamond shape, and so the edges of each square above touch the tops and are supported by the bigger squares underneath, and this creates a progression of elevation in a roof. And there are lantern towers, there are lantern roofs in many cultures. In terms of human attempts at reaching elevations that are higher and higher, this was a basic form, just taking a square and just going higher and higher through it, which level, and you slowly raise the roof through that. But that notion of four-pointedness, of squareness, became manifest in the ground plans of entire complexes, and you can see that there were entrances from the four directions representing spiritual attributes, spiritual force, you might say the fundamental elements of fire, water, earth, and air. All of them were representing, you might say, aspects of our own human beingness, our instinctive, our moving aspect, our feeling aspect, our thinking aspect. These needed to be brought into integration, and at the center is another square at the very top. That could have been the lantern roof that we were looking at, or something very similar. That lantern, that black square in the middle on that temple, in that temple complex, represents the unity of all the four elements into the fifth element, which was known as ether, or spirit, or that which transcended, breaking up the ether represented the portal, the gateway into the transcendent realm for human consciousness. It also represented, interestingly enough, the sex center, the energy of sex, the energy that unifies, the energy that basically creates in human life, represented also this energy of ether, the energy of integration, and the possibility for transcending, getting into a state that breaks down. And so this is a stupa that is not Hindu but Buddhist. You can see the massiveness of it. It is actually pretty big, and this stupa would have been the reliquary for a saint, or maybe perhaps even a reliquary for one of the Buddha's artifacts, something that was left from the Buddha. Who knows, a tooth, something. And this was a place of great pilgrimage, and also it was a monastery. But you can see that it's in squares that are building higher and higher and higher. As a matter of fact, I think this is that. This is the ground plan of what you just saw, Paharpur. So the topmost area of that would house the artifact, and this would be where the pilgrim would come. And the building itself represented different levels of initiation, self-initiation, or initiation into realizing deeper and deeper levels of meditation and awakening. And so by the time one realized that the ultimate, the topmost part, then one would come to also the highest realization in oneself. This was a symbol for that journey of spiritual growth and final realization. But this was a very, very massive building, as you can see, and it wasn't open. It was basically mostly solid, except for where they placed the reliquary. And now we come to another great stupa. So these stupas were basically a Buddhist form. The circularity and the domicality, the domeness of the shape represents, once again, this idea that was passed on through other architectural traditions, the idea of perfection, the spheres of perfection. And so that circularity, and yet having 4 different entrances, and that square in the center representing the point at which one lifts off one's platform into a higher dimension. All of this, the way that it's laid out, the way that it's constructed, it's intended to evoke in the viewer and in the experiencer this undeniable sense that we have a transcendent reason for being here. That these structures aren't just there for tourists to visit now. They're there even today to awaken in each of us who are open to it, who are still alive to this kind of information. That is meant to awaken in us the ability to access those higher potentials in ourselves. So it may be simple, but it isn't, because this mandala, as this circular, this wheel shape, as seen from above, indicates the idea of cyclical existence, and yet through the ascension through the vertical movement, one can leave that cyclical existence altogether. And that's the point, because when you see it, there it is. The horizontal aspect is the cyclical existence, going around and around in a circle. The vertical ascension means going through the different spiritual levels, the different levels of consciousness, to that point where consciousness cannot ever again be entrapped in cyclicality. at least not convincingly. And so this is Sanchi, a beautiful, beautiful stupa that housed a great relic, and obviously dedicated to the Buddha with all the different elephants and so forth on the carved entranceway to this side. So these places were meant to be circumambulated, which means you go in a circle clockwise, I believe. And this meant, in a sense, turning the wheel of Dharma, turning the wheel of the teaching, turning the wheel of our own evolution. In other words, consciously evolving was the whole point of all of these structures. The idea that we have the ability somehow to go beyond accidental life, to go beyond just being accidental visitors that are controlled by external forces. No, these artifacts, these great works of architecture and art, all point to this one truth, that we as human beings have the possibility of consciously evolving, of consciously going beyond just mechanical existence. We are not necessarily subject just to mechanical existence, not to the laws that govern mechanical existence, that somehow we're connected to something that is beyond just mere mechanics and physics. And Nagarjunakonda, this is the ground plan. Once again, a huge, huge stupa complex. These great reliquaries of the Buddhists were massive. They were massive structures housing one or two holy artifacts sometimes. And Nagarjunakonda relates to Nagarjuna, one of the great founding Mahayana Buddhist patriarchs, if you will. Not a patriarch in the real sense, more like one of the manifestors of non-dualistic life. Nagarjuna was that, and so Nagarjunakonda was dedicated, possibly, I think, to his relics. And so he's one of the biggies in Buddhism, at least in northern Buddhism. And so as you can see, it's a small portion of what used to be here, but a very massive structure. And basically you accessed the reliquary, the Holy of Holies, if you will, the place where the sacred relics were kept through these stairways. And the role of reverential attitudes is so obvious in Indian art and architecture that everything related to this evolutionary path, the spiritual path of evolution, was I guess it was the main focus for everyone. Spirituality was given a very, very high place, in contradistinction to some other cultures where it wasn't so much so. Here we have a corbelled arch, as you can see. A beautiful shape, but you can see that the only thing that's supporting it is the brickwork underneath. It's just all gravity. There is no real dynamic tension in terms of an arch. They've just cut away the stone to form an arch. So it's a beautiful corbelled arch, but it isn't of any, you might say, dynamic structural significance. So this is the way of the Maya, this is the way of a lot of the early Indian and other cultures. And so, although it seems to be more primitive, it certainly has withstood the test of time too. Many of these still stand after thousands of years. And now we're going to come to one of the final places, and one of the, you might say, first Buddhist sources of pilgrimage. This is the Ajanta, the famous Ajanta caves, which are basically carved into the basalt rock of this Almost looks like a crater. And the work is unbelievable in the sense that instead of building something out of stone that has been carved, they basically carved everything, all the statues, all the pillars, everything out of the solid rock. So it's it's one of the great works that humanity has generated on this planet. So let's take a look. As you can see, everything has been incised into the very hard basalt. So imagine a huge wall of rock, and then sculptors going through and chiseling and picking their way through this and creating these slender columns and these wonderful images. This is BC, this is many thousands of years old. And yet, you can see the dedication and the expression in these forms is very communicative. A lot of this work, a lot of the sculpture has to do with the life of the Buddha, the Jataka tales, basically the various previous incarnations of Buddha. But each and every one of these passages and temples that have been built into the rock are once again expressing through the most solid of elements the principle of enlightenment. It is in fact very interesting that human beings have chosen to express the most ephemeral, the most inexpressible in the hardest and the densest types of materials. And so this is one of the great temples and chapels, one of the great chapels inside, showing the Buddha at the end of it, showing his moment of enlightenment and his first sermon. And so when we look at these works and see the effort it took, it isn't based on just ordinary efforts. This is not about just surviving. This is not about just living for oneself for the moment. This was intended to be passed on. This information was important enough to these human beings that they made every known effort at the time, and even efforts that they didn't know were possible, and they put these efforts into expressing the idea of the ultimate goal of human life. The ultimate goal of all life is to realize perfect enlightenment, the perfection of life here. Because the Buddha didn't come as a deity. The Buddha came as a human being, showing the way that every human being can go. That it is possible for every human being, everyone, to realize the highest possible consciousness in this form, in this human beingness. And that, not only that, all forms, all life had that possibility. The Buddhist teachings really were about compassion and love. There was not a rejection of human life. Obviously, this couple is a sexual couple, yet they have the crowns, the diadems of deities. The human being could become a divine manifestation. Even through, no, not even through. Sex was not somehow put apart. It was an integral part of our humanity and our path to conscious realization, the highest conscious realization. There is not a single sense of rejection of the human form or of its sensuality or of its beauty. As long as it's in perfect balance, it's a go. And then here we come, of course, to probably the most famous painting from the Ajanta caves is Padmapani, the bodhisattva of, once again, compassion, kindness, generosity. And in essence, interesting that this beautiful form of art expresses something that every one of us at this very instant can still access. True compassion, true kindness, true generosity. And in a sense, it also represents the Buddha giving the sermon on the flower that became the foundation of Zen Buddhism, the instantaneous enlightenment. You don't have to go through countless lifetimes. You don't have to go through countless lifetimes to finally realize the perfect enlightenment, the perfect awakening, the perfect way of being in one lifetime. In this lifetime, this very one, this inexpressible, this flower, you know, what is the nature of existence? What's the nature of reality? What's the nature of awakening, true awakening? The Buddha didn't do anything, he just looked at this flower. And from that Bodhidharma, apparently was the only one who got it, that, okay, what can't be said, what can't be stated, what can't be given in terms of anything manifest is in fact the essence of everything. That this wordless, nameless reality is in fact the very essence of each and every one of us right now. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next month, not 100 years from now, not 100 lifetimes from now. Right now. That inexpressible essence of what? We could call it God, but that still doesn't say it. That inexpressible essence of nothing. And even that doesn't say it. It is both expressed and inexpressible. And so, Padmapani, very, very serene. And imagine that this artist, and it's always been a true revelation for me to see transcendent works of art, works of art that open us up. Now imagine what it's like to be that artist, for someone to be able to paint this, to be able to carve whatever it is, to be able to play that music, to dance that dance, to cook that supper, that dinner, that to give a greeting in that way. We can all do that. Right now. Just bring it out of our... It's in us. It is us. Bring that out. So just a hop, skip, and a jump across the channel from India is what's now Sri Lanka. And there, Buddhism was first established. One of the first places that Buddhism thrived was in India and also in Sri Lanka. And then it went east as well. And here we have the Thuparama of Anuradhapura, basically. Pardon my pronunciation. It is circular, it is a stupa, it houses sacred relics. And as you can see, the circularity and the bell shape indicates, once again, an evolution, kind of like a hierarchical ascendancy in the actual layout of the plan. And here's the real structure itself, with prayer flags around it. And so this structure can be entered, but once again, one does a circumambulation clockwise, denoting the turning of the wheel of Dharma, the turning of the wheel of knowledge and being presence that will, in fact, awaken everything in the universe. Circles, and yet squares, and then more circles. Ascending. Ever ascending. And the gold piece on top represents that point of, you might say, final enlightenment, final nirvanic co-emergence, where there is no more coming or going. One is what one is, and there is nothing else but that. There's nothing. And another one of these stupas, the Watadagi at Polonnaruwa in Sri Lanka. Pardon my fumbling with the verbiage at this point. But as you can see, this one has all circles. It doesn't have a square. So basically, it's just kind of like a portal, and you can see this in the actual overview from above. And here's the actual location, with a statue of the Buddha in front and the great bodhisattvas on either side of the stairs as you enter the sacred sanctuary. And that Buddha that you see in the background was built and carved on a very, very strict set of canonical guidelines. The canons of proportions for Buddhistic art have been continued and still are being used to this very day. And so this frame of reference that all Buddhist statues have can now be seen in this one. As you can see, there's the shape, the form, and the proportion of it. And this is, of course, a very ancient statue, an ancient sculpture of the Buddha in lotus position, half lotus, or not even half lotus, but in some kind of position. I'm not quite sure what the yogic position is there. And then you go over here, and this is a modern version, and once again you see the same proportion, the same canon of sculpting applied to modern works right down from the ancient traditions. So these architectural and artistic traditions are still being carried on actively today by living masters who are continuing to make these works so that they can, in effect, keep transmitting the essence of the teaching that is inherent in each of these. In this case, the idea of all awakening, the idea of shunyata, the voidness that is all and beyond all, is basically the teaching behind the Buddha's most profound expressions. And in these particular works, there is a sense of not only peace and tranquility, but absolute impartiality and equipoise. There is balance in it. There is balance, and it can't be unbalanced, as it were, by anything that comes up in the world. The Buddha is a manifester of that balance for us, a demonstrator. These images, anyway, these images of that principle are attempting to give us that sense of balance. And not too far away, in another culture, but not very far from one another geographically, this is the very famous and still usable symbol that was developed at the same time as the Buddha by the great Taoist masters like Lao Tzu and Chung Tzu and others before and after them. This is the symbol of the Tai Chi, but in the middle of it is the great Dhow, the ultimate, the supreme ultimate in the middle of the changing world, which is represented by the 8 trigrams. And so this representation of reality by the Chinese mind and by the Chinese consciousness to us today is still as relevant as when it was first invented, because we all understand what it means to be in balance or out of balance. The interesting thing about the Chinese approach to reality is that nature is the demonstrator of the way to attain ultimate realization. That nature, not some abstract spiritual something beyond, is the way to learn and to realize our true potential. No, everything around us, everything in life, everything can point and teach us how to be one with the ultimate ground of everything. And that's a very beautiful way of expression, very similar to the southwestern cultures of North America, the Anasazi and the Pueblo cultures had an incredible, and still have an incredible, reverence for the earth and for nature. And it is the same with the Taoists. The true Taoists were always in accord with nature, always trying to become one with nature, not trying to separate and divorce themselves from it. And so, as you can see, this this is a long and twisty path to a spiritual sanctuary, a temple, located, perched probably on some mountainside, and no doubt about it, one would have to pay attention, one would have to really be present all the way in order to actually even get to a place like this, where you would be given the practices and teachings from the Taoist masters, and through that open up to your true nature and to the ultimate reality of everything, and in effect become of real service then to the greater universe. That you as a human being are not just connected to the earth, you are connected to the stars, you are connected to beyond the stars, and that you and each human being, each consciousness can in effect, once becoming unified, once unified with the all, can then become a co-creator with the all. As you can see, the point of spiritual work was to create these highly intense situations where one would have to pay attention, have to be awake. Now, building a temple, a monastery on the edge of a sheer cliff, just the building of it must have taken incredible attention and focus and concentration in order to realize this structure and to live here, to work here spiritually, to do one's practice here, would be that kind of constant shock to the system that one needs to always be awake and pay attention, because nature pays attention. Nature isn't asleep. Nature is not asleep. It rests when needing to rest, but it is always awake. When has anyone ever noticed nature being asleep? And of course, because these are built in such awe-inspiring, shockingly vivid locations, obviously the journey to these places required, first of all, real determination and fortitude to get there. But to be present in these locations also inspired being as fully awake as one was capable of. That it was one's duty, one's real work, to be fully attentive while one was in a space like this. That nature was the great demonstrator of spiritual evolution. That nature would be the demonstrator of how one would realize perfect enlightenment. The architecture, as one can see, is not strictly symmetrical. There's a great deal of asymmetricity, and yet this individual kind of angulation and focus, in a sense, blends together in the whole. Everything comes together as a whole. And that's another profound teaching in the Taoist tradition, that there are individual qualities, individual idiosyncrasies, one might say, and yet the totality accommodates all of them. Not just temporarily, but ultimately. That everything is accommodated in nature. No matter how extreme it may seem, nature has a balancing force to it that will basically bring it into harmony with the whole. That is truly profound if we could only understand that in ourselves. That all our extremes, all our supposed good and bad elements are in fact supported by a ground that can accommodate the most that we can give in any direction. That nature, our true nature, can accommodate anything. It is in effect balance itself. It can never be thrown out of balance, our true nature. And so Chinese art and architecture writes scriptures in nature. Nature itself becomes the tablet through which, the book through which we learn the deepest secrets about reality. Truly unbelievable. Truly unbelievable, because it is so in keeping with a way of life that is respectful of the planet. Now we're talking the Taoist tradition. This isn't necessarily what's in China, but the Taoists were in China, and there are those who follow the same way of balance in other cultures too. This is not culturally limited or originated necessarily from the Chinese, but the Chinese Taoists are the ones that so effectively have presented this principle to all of us. And it continues to be a living tradition. It continues to be something that we can live by right now. To always know that there is a balance to everything. Certainly helps one overcome any kind of disruption in one's personal life or life in general. There is a greater balance that will rebalance what appears to be out of balance. And the Tao is the way. It is the way. And it is still the way it can be the way for all of us. Once again, the Temple of Heaven idea has been represented in Chinese work through the hierarchical layers that ascend to the topmost level. So not unlike many other cultures that have used that kind of hierarchy to sort of describe to humans what reality is like. It's different scales and different levels, and you have to realize them through diligent work and going from one level to the next level to the next level. And you don't miss any levels. And that's one which to it. However, that is not all there is. But for tonight, we're going to wrap it up and thank you for being with us. I'd like to ask Deborah Judith to do an invocational piece, The Way of Balance, to finish the evening. And then we wish you all a very, very open and balanced life. Deborah Judith.